Lots of talk about tariffs, plus the state of Ohio has a brand new lieutenant governor.
It's a Scott Sands Show.
Hi there. How y'all doing? Thank you so much for finding the podcast version of the show. You can subscribe on YouTube. We'll be on all the other platforms shortly this week to get everything re-registered. It's episode officially 2533 of the Scott Sands Show. You can find me on Facebook, the Scott Sands Show. I am on X at Scott Sands Media, Instagram, all the other platforms as well. Kurt Couchman from Americans for Prosperity will join me as a guest this afternoon, and we'll get into some of Trump's tariffs and what that could mean for us. I've mentioned this, I know, on the last few episodes of the podcast that I've done, but I do want to make it clear, and then I'll leave it alone after a few more days probably. I'm not doing this podcast. Well, I'm not doing it to make money, that's for sure. I'm doing it to have fun and continue to be able to talk to you guys. And I appreciate you listening all the years on WSPD, but I'm not doing this podcast as a replacement for listening to the radio by any means. Please continue to listen to my old station, WSPD, and most importantly, continue to support all of the local advertisers who spend money on iHeartRadio and local radio, local TV, local media. They certainly need your support right now. I'll talk about the Super Bowl in just a second, but the breaking news earlier this afternoon, Jim Tressel, former coach from the Ohio State University, is our brand new lieutenant governor. That announcement made earlier this morning by Ohio Governor Mike DeWine. This coming just a week or so after naming John Husted, former lieutenant governor, as the replacement in the U.S. Senate to J.D. Vance, now our vice president for Donald Trump. Governor DeWine saying, I want someone who kind of shared my vision for the state of Ohio, and that is that we want everyone to live up to their God-given potential. Tressel, of course, you know him from the Buckeyes, you know him for his sweater vest, you know him as the former president of Youngstown State University. And this, to me, is a pretty interesting pick for a couple of reasons. I don't think we know a lot about Tressel's politics, although we can certainly assume by some of his posts and the people who he has supported in the past that he does have conservative leanings. He's probably a Republican, and education has really been one of his focuses, which is what the governor has said he would like Jim Tressel as lieutenant governor to focus on, and that's education and workforce development, much of the same things that John Husted was doing while he was lieutenant governor. And why I find this pick interesting, and again, I'm making quite a few assumptions here, but I don't believe that Mike DeWine would like to see Vivek Ramaswamy as governor of Ohio. I've not talked to Governor DeWine about that. That's just my assumption. I believe that as we learn more about Jim Tressel's politics, we'll learn that Tressel is probably a Republican in the same vein as Mike DeWine and John Kasich, perhaps more of what you might consider a moderate Republican. Some of you may say Rhino. And because I believe with the polling numbers that I've seen, Vivek leading Dave Yost, who was just on the podcast last week, if Mike DeWine is trying to push Jim Tressel into politics, he may see Tressel as the best option to be able to defeat Vivek in the Republican primary for governor. And that certainly would leave many of you, I think, with an interesting choice between, especially with MAGA world so behind Vivek, and the popularity that Vivek has in MAGA world with Trump Republicans in the state of Ohio and the popularity of Donald Trump in Ohio. That may be an interesting choice. Or, if you split the Tressel Vivek vote, that may benefit Dave Yost as well. So I think that's interesting. And the question was asked in the press conference earlier whether or not DeWine and Jim Tressel had talked about whether or not he would make a run for the governorship in 2026. They said no, they hadn't really talked about it, but Jim Tressel did say, I believe in our governor and what he believes in, and my first job is to go to school on that and see if I can evolve and make a difference in a state that has been so special to us. Talking about he and his wife making that decision to accept Mike DeWine's appointment to the lieutenant governor position. So this is going to be an interesting story to watch. And from a timeline perspective, if Tressel is going to run for governor, that's probably a decision he's going to need to make within the next couple of months and be able to go to set the fundraising groundwork, the staff groundwork that would need to be done to make a gubernatorial run in 2026 and make that announcement soon, because field's getting crowded. We've already got Dave Yost out there, Vivek expected to make it official any day now. Dr. Amy Acton, oddly, DeWine's former chief medical consultant for the state of Ohio, in the race for the Democrats, and we'll probably see a couple of more Democrats making their announcement for the Democrat primary very soon as well. So that's the story we're going to watch in the state of Ohio. Jim Tressel, your new lieutenant governor. Last night, Super Bowl 59, like most of you, I'm sure, watched the game last night. I went to my buddy Jamie Wietrikowski's beautiful barn dough to watch the Super Bowl with some friends from Third Street Cigar. Jamie from Four Guys on a Roof, of course. I love going to Super Bowl parties. I love watching football and sports with a bunch of friends. Of course, enjoy having a nice cigar and maybe a bourbon as well. All the food that comes out for a big Super Bowl party. Norm and Jeremy smoked some delicious wings. Matt brought his homemade chili. Actually, I think Matt's wife most likely made the delicious chili. Plenty of other snacks, sloppy joes. Jamie had sloppy joes that were fantastic, and I do love to cook. I wish I'd planned far enough ahead and made my world famous collards, but instead I brought dessert, which is odd for somebody trying to lose weight, as I've been doing. I'm down 100 pounds. On the Rixa Health plan at rixahealth.com, GLP-1s, tirzepatide. I brought dessert. It was a Super Bowl being held in New Orleans, so I wanted to bring a taste of New Orleans to the Super Bowl party at Jamie's, and I called everywhere Sunday, and I posted on Facebook. So somebody in town has to have a king cake, right? And I finally found one. A king cake is delicious. It's a pastry that's got like a filling in the middle and a cream cheese frosting on top. I found a Gambino's Bakery king cake, an actual Gambino's from New Orleans king cake at Fresh Market, and it was fantastic. It was a great taste of home. I did have a slice, maybe two small slices. If you're not familiar with the king cake tradition, and Mardi Gras Fat Tuesday is coming up, I think it's March 5th. So maybe for Fat Tuesday, and instead of getting a punch cake, you can get a king cake to celebrate with your friends, or bring in a king cake to the office. The tradition, and there's a little plastic baby hidden somewhere in the king cake, and if you get the baby in your slice of king cake, that's supposed to bring you good luck and prosperity through the year. And the tradition is you're also supposed to buy the next king cake. But I bought those two. I bought the two Gambino's king cakes. So I should be good for a couple of years. I should be able to get the baby twice and not have to worry about it. Gambino's, one of my favorite places for a king cake in New Orleans. If you're looking, you can get them shipped here and get different sizes shipped from Gambino's. But I'm told by my friends on the coast that a bakery, Dong Fong, apparently has a better king cake now than Gambino's. I've not tried those. And my buddy Robert St. John, who runs a bunch of restaurants in Mississippi, has a bakery now. I think it's called Loblolly, maybe, that is supposed to be really good as well. I, as a king cake aficionado, would like to try both of those at some point. But I that's the best part of going. I love being around friends and having the cigar and cheering during a game. But the spread of food at a Super Bowl party is great. The downside, though, being around so many people, and Jamie had a bunch of his friends over to watch the Super Bowl at his barn dough. But for somebody like me, I can watch the game. That's fine. But I also want to be able to have an opinion on things like the commercials and the Super Bowl halftime show. So it's more work for me because I have to leave the game after the game and come home to watch the Super Bowl halftime show and all of the commercials so I can form an opinion and be able to talk about them. I'm not at this point, because this is a podcast. We're not talking in real time. I'm not going to go through all of the commercials or the halftime show. I know many of you may not have gotten or liked Kendrick Lamar. I certainly, as a music fan, I would have rather seen a rock band or a country star and somebody I know. But I do love hip hop. I'm not familiar with Kendrick Lamar that much. And they could have had Lil Wayne. They could have had New Orleans guy Lil Wayne do the halftime show instead, and that would have been fun. I like Lil Wayne. I didn't get all of the imagery, the music of Kendrick Lamar, but I'm not going to criticize it either because I do enjoy hip hop and R&B music as well. The commercials were pretty good. I thought. I thought there were some better commercials. It was nice to see the Clydesdales back after a few years. That Seal commercial for Mountain Dew will haunt me forever. I hope I I hope Seal got paid a shit ton of money for the Mountain Dew commercial. Meg Ryan and Billy Crystal in the Hellman's Mayonnaise commercial, reuniting them from When Harry Met Sally. That was fun. I had seen that earlier in the week. Pringles, WeatherTech, Instacart, ChatGPT all had some eye-catching, memorable commercials that were fun. But I think the one that stood out to me the most, and maybe it was for you as well, was the very patriotic commercial, which was essentially a 2-minute film starring Harrison Ford that Jeep did. The Toledo-built Jeep had a fantastic commercial. That's worth going back to find on the internet. Watch it on YouTube if you didn't see the Jeep commercial or didn't have a chance to soak it all in. I think I've watched that 3 or 4 times today. And thorough, I thought that was very well done. Harrison Ford, an interesting choice. And I'm sure throughout the day today, if you've been listening to the radio, you're probably hearing Hannity and Beck and Fred and Pags talking about Taylor Swift getting booed and Donald Trump getting massive cheers. I'm sure I see this differently than a lot of other conservative hosts and maybe a lot of you, but I didn't like nor am I happy that Taylor Swift was booed. I mean, what did she do to y'all? Look, I get it. Maybe you're tired of seeing Taylor on NFL games. Maybe you're upset that she endorsed Kamala Harris, but that's her right to do so. I don't believe we should hate somebody just because they have a different political opinion. And I'm personally a Swiftie. I'm not ashamed. Take away points from my man card if you want. I'm not ashamed to admit that I'm a Swiftie. I do enjoy your music. I've seen her concerts a half a dozen times. I just went up to Ford Field on the Eras tour and saw her. I think she's very talented. I think she's overall a pretty wholesome entertainer that young women can look up to and admire and respect and strive to be more like. By all accounts, Taylor Swift is kind to her crew. She donates a lot of money to charities. So I'm not going to be happy because the crowd booed her just because she voted for somebody that I didn't vote for. I don't think that's anything to be celebrated. And some of the boos may have been from fans who were tired of seeing her on TV whenever the Chiefs do something nice. And may have been from a lot of Eagles fans in the Superdome in New Orleans, because from most of the accounts I've seen, the crowd at the Dome was about 75% Eagles fans. So that may have been some of it too. It may not have been politically motivated at all. It may have just been Eagles fans who don't like that she supports Travis Kelce and the Chiefs. A couple of my favorite moments from the game itself. I love seeing Toledo Rockets standouts, Quinyon Mitchell and Dallas Scant on the Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles, former Rocket Kareem Hunt, now back on the Chiefs as well. But I think the storyline from last night that's worth pointing out again, and I'm an Alabama Crimson Tide guy, but that aside, let me tell you, last night was something special. If you've been following like the roller coaster career of Jalen Hurts, You might remember if you watched the games when Jalen Hurts was playing for Nick Saban in Alabama. He was SEC Offensive Player of the Year as a freshman, and then he got benched at halftime during the national championship game, kind of like he was, I don't know, sitting a timeout on his mama's couch. But we're talking about that Jalen Hurts. He's sitting there after being benched at halftime in the national championship game that Alabama was close to losing, and watched Tua Tagovailoa come in to save the day. That's got to be humiliating. It's got to give you, if nothing else, a sense of humility. But that's really where the story gets good. That very next year, Tua Tagovailoa in the SEC championship game went down. And who stepped up? Jalen Hurts, of course. And he led Alabama to win the SEC title. And you may be thinking that's a nice little redemption arc. He went on to have success at Oklahoma. We still claim him at Alabama, though, by the way, whenever he does something good. When he throws an interception, he's former Oklahoma quarterback Jalen Hurts. When he throws a touchdown to Devontae to seal the game, he's former Alabama quarterback. And last night, if we fast forward the story of Jalen Hurts to Super Bowl 59, now as quarterback for the Eagles, he goes toe-to-toe with Patrick Mahomes. And Kansas City just wasn't ready. Philadelphia dominated, and now Jalen Hurts is not just the Super Bowl winner, he's also the MVP of the game. And I'm not really cheering on the Eagles by any stretch, although it was nice to see Kansas City lose. That was kind of like a bonus, like finding an extra chicken wing in your takeout box. Unexpected but delightful. Jalen Hurts, the quarterback who turned being benched into a punchline for his success story, is and should be the new tale that we tell kids when they're down about not making the team. I'm sure you've all heard or shared with your kids maybe the story of Michael Jordan getting cut from his high school team. This is now about Jalen Hurts, who went from being on the sidelines in a national championship game to becoming the Super Bowl MVP in less time than it takes Alabama to win another title. So congratulations, Jalen. You've given us all, I think, a lesson in tenacity and self-fortitude and maybe just a touch of sweet, sweet revenge. So I hope Jalen keeps on shining and proving them wrong. And, of course, I got to say, roll Tide. Before we get to Kurt Couchman, I mentioned I watched the Super Bowl party at Jamie's house last night from 4guysonaroof.com. Locally owned, more than 30 years in business here in Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan, and an Owens Corning Platinum Preferred Partner. We are heading into the spring now, so if you're thinking about getting a roof replacement or if you need some roof repairs done after this winter, you should get on the schedule now, 4guysonaroof.com. And they can actually get your roof done in as little as 1 day, which is why they are the extreme roofer. 4guysonaroof.com. Kurt Couchman from Americans for Prosperity joins me now on the podcast version of the Scott Sand Show. You can find him on X at Kurt Couchman and AFPHQ. Kurt, it's great to have you back on. I appreciate your time.
Hey, Scott. It's really good to be back with you here.
So a lot of talk about tariffs. I think since Trump was inaugurated and even before then, there's been a mention of a tariff just about every day. And I want to get into some of the peculiars of that, and we can get as wonky as you want throughout the conversation. But let's just start there, the basics. Talk to me like I was educated in Mississippi and Alabama, because I was, and explain the mechanics of how a tariff works and what a tariff is.
Sure, absolutely. But before diving into that, I just want to say from the outset that Americans for Prosperity's number one priority for 2025 is extending and improving on the Trump tax cuts. They brought prosperity. We've got a $20 million campaign called Protect Prosperity to promote that and to help Congress get where they need to make that legacy item something that can continue on and keep providing benefits for Americans. So
and that really should be President Trump and this Congress's first priority, is making those permanent and at least extending them.
Absolutely. No question about that. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. There's a lot of politics involved in figuring out, how to change all the dials, but we're committed to helping them get it done. So, okay. So tariffs. Tariffs are a tax on imported goods. They do raise revenue for the federal government. They impact the terms of trade, which is the value of the U.S. dollar compared to other currencies. They will often provide some benefits to protected industries that typically comes at the cost of consumers of the same goods. Um, and how all that nets out, you have to do a bunch of economic analysis to figure out how that works. Now, I and most other economists think about tariffs in a certain sort of way. President Trump seems to think about them in a very different way. He uses them for strategic leverage by and large, because he has other objectives that he's looking to achieve. And so far, we've already seen some fruit from that approach in terms of Canada and Mexico. We'll see what happens with the 10% tariff on China that has been imposed. They have done retaliatory tariffs, but we're at the beginning of a process, and we'll have to see how it plays out.
So you mentioned Trump looks at tariffs differently. He is using them so far, at least, and he did in his first term as well, as a negotiating tool to try to negotiate better trade terms, to negotiate a more border security. Is the threat of a tariff an effective negotiating tactic?
Within limits, it can be, or at least it seems to be. It wasn't. It didn't take too long for Mexico to revise some of its policies with respect to migrants and commit to combating fentanyl uh, smuggling more aggressively. But again, we're so early in the stages of this that we're just going to have to see what comes of it. There are costs. There are real costs that come from tariffs, and we have to be mindful of that. But this president is using them in unconventional ways compared to his predecessors, and so it's a different mental model that we have to get used to.
Can you think, Kurt, of any historical examples of how a tariff has affected the economy in the long term or short term?
Sure. I mean, there's the idea, Alexander Hamilton was famous for it, of protecting nascent industries. But of course, over the course of his life, which was unfortunately cut short, he had a number of different perspectives on tariff policy. Now, during the 19th century, there were periods when tariff revenue made up most of the federal government's revenue. But you have to remember that at the time, the federal government was only about 3% of the economy, of GDP, in terms of what its spending was. So it was a greater share, of course, but the federal government was much, much smaller up until around the time of Woodrow Wilson. So you have to make sure you're adjusting when you talk about those things. And
It's
then
pretty unrealistic to expect the elimination of taxes and make up for that revenue solely through tariffs. That's an impracticability.
yeah, I mean, there is some revenue that comes in, but it's not plausible to think that we could finance the entire federal government or a substantial share of the federal government today through tariffs. And the other thing that's changed so much in the last century or so is the degree of globalization of supply chains. It used to be that you would build something and then you would send it abroad, more or less complete. But now there's all these different components that cross national borders back and forth. I grew up in northern Pennsylvania. My dad's a retired metallurgist, did a lot with the automobile industry. And the US and Canada and Mexico, very integrated. You will have pieces of components that will get built in one place and then they'll get assembled in one place. And then there's all these different subsystems that sort of accumulate based on what makes the most sense for keeping overall costs down so that they can provide an affordable product to consumers.
So generally, how is a way that a tariff could be beneficial to the U.S. economy?
For the economy, the most beneficial thing would be to get foreign countries to reduce discrimination against American goods and services. That's the main thing.
What about a negative impact? I'm looking at the possibility of an increase in inflation during a period of a tariff war.
Yeah, tariffs are taxes, and like all taxes, they impose deadweight losses on the economy. There's no question about that. The inflationary argument, though, I'm not persuaded by, and here's why. Because inflation is the result of the money supply growing faster than the underlying production of goods and services. If you were to have, a trade war with such a substantial impact on the production of goods and services, without affecting the money supply, then yeah, there could be some inflation there. But as long as the Federal Reserve is making sure that the money supply growth is in line with the overall economic growth, then you wouldn't have broad-based inflation. What you would have is relative changes in price levels between goods that are imported versus domestically produced goods and services.
So I want to get to China in a second, but it seems like Trump has threatened the highest tariff rate on Mexico and Canada. How does that affect the USMCA deal?
Uh, so I haven't reviewed the MCA deal in detail, but Mexico and Canada are some of our top trading partners, both for goods and services. And we're a big economy, we're a big market for them, and we're very highly integrated. So there's much more leverage over Canada and Mexico from tariffs on them from the United States, whereas China's across the ocean. Yes, it's a big producer of things, and America's a big consumer of them, but there are more options that China already has connections to in a pretty robust way than Mexico and China does because or Mexico and Canada do because they're both right here. America's a big open market to them. But to the extent that there are actions by the U.S. federal government that are inconsistent with our USMCA or other international commitment obligations, then there are provisions within those treaties or agreements for, I guess, evaluation or arbitration. It depends on the particular instrument, but they have ways of resolving disputes.
And Mexico and Canada rely more on the U.S. economy than we do theirs, where as opposed to China, we certainly are more reliant upon Chinese goods
Mhm.
than Mexico and Canada. So and that's why I want to get back to that in a second. The other announcement that as we're talking today, Kurt, we're expecting to hear confirmation from President Trump on a new tariff on steel and aluminum, which I think
Mhm.
also has national security implications.
Yeah, and national security is obviously a reasonable exception to a general policy of free trade. There are some critical things that we need to be able to have for our national security. One of the questions, of course, is what the right instrument for that is. In addition to tariffs, there are purchase orders. There are things under the Defense Production Act where you can negotiate directly with companies to get them to produce things. That was misused to some degree during the pandemic. That wasn't really national security, but it was an important moment, of course. So, but with respect to automotives or steel and aluminum and other materials that are used in a lot of downstream sectors, when President Trump put the steel and aluminum tariffs on imported metals, there were some benefits to aluminum and steel producing facilities. However, they were more than offset by costs to steel and aluminum using industries. So where I come from, there's a lot of sintered metal. It's where heat and pressure make specialty parts. There's tool and die. There's not so much casting, but there's some of that in other parts of Pennsylvania. And there were other headwinds that they were facing, but that certainly didn't help. And there were a number of manufacturing jobs that went away during that time. Again, not entirely due to that, but it certainly didn't help. And if we are thinking holistically about the economy, then we need to be looking at the effects of tariffs, not only on the immediately affected industries, but also downstream and upstream and all around.
Automotive, everything else that's affected. And I think we'll
Yep.
see the most immediate impact with this potential U.S. steel deal, which interestingly, Donald Trump and Joe Biden both opposed the sale of U.S. steel. But now Trump seems to be open to it, even in the midst of these steel and aluminum tariff talks.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about that is the U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with Japan. We have since right after World War II. And, they're one of our closest allies. They're absolutely critical to whatever our posture towards checking China's military rise might be, whether it's offshore balancing or something else. And so it's a close partner, Japan is, and we should welcome investment from Japan and lots of other places into the US, because that investment leads to more updated machines, equipment, software, training, all sorts of resources that make American workers more productive. When we're more productive, we earn more, and then we have a lot more options for pursuing our own individual version of the American dream.
Plus, it keeps jobs here in America, even if the company is foreignly owned.
Hmm.
But I do think it is critical that we maintain the ability to manufacture steel and aluminum for national security reasons here on American soil. In the event something does go wrong, whether it be 10, 20, 50 years down the road, we need to have that manufacturing capability here in the United States. Kurt
Yes.
Couchman here is here on the Scott Sand Show. Kurt's with the Americans for Prosperity. AFPHQ.com is the website, and you can find him on X at Kurt Couchman. Let's go to China for a second. A 10% tariff has been suggested by President Trump. What does this do to our trade deficit, and how might that benefit the American economy?
Oh, just to go back 1 second, our website is americansforprosperity.org. So I just want to make sure your listeners can find us. But a 10% tariff on China, the direct impact would be to make goods from China more expensive for American consumers, which is not only households, but also the businesses that rely on some of those pieces that are intermediate goods on the way to final production. So that's the immediate impact. We could see further attempts at trade diversion. There's been some allegations that Mexico has become a place where Chinese goods are shipped, and then they're shipped from Mexico to the United States to avoid the duty. So I'm sure this administration is looking closely into that. China's announced that they're going to retaliate. They've imposed tariffs on a number of US goods. And so that will reduce the amount of those goods that are sold from the US into China. Agricultural products are quite sensitive. We export a lot of agricultural goods, especially to China. They have a huge population. Their land mass is actually very similar to ours, but America's just the breadbasket for the world. We're fantastic at producing agricultural goods.
So, what's the danger, if there is a danger, of an escalating trade war with China?
Well, I don't think anybody intends that. I don't think the president intends to have an escalating trade war. I think what he's trying to do is to have some leverage to push them to resolve a number of long simmering conflicts. And there's a whole list of things when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship. But yeah, if we do end up in a trade war, that could undermine the prosperity that the president supports, that we support, and that's why I don't think that he wants that. Um, but it's a leverage game, and as like I said in the beginning, he's taking a different approach to all of this than previous presidents have done.
So, these proposed tariffs, the talk of reciprocal tariffs, is this a form of protectionism for the United States? Is that a new policy for the U.S. under Donald Trump?
It might be. I mean, he's talked about tariffs for a very long time. Um, Again, like there are alternatives. If we want to spur manufacturing capability, make steel and aluminum and so many other things in this country, there are things that this administration is doing that are really promising. Like the Doge, for example, going through and looking for all kinds of nonsense, whether it's wasteful spending or regulations that don't make sense, like a full-scale checkup of saying, hey, is this thing actually serving the American people? That's really valuable. And there's things that we do, or I should say that the Biden administration in particular did, that made conventional energy so much more expensive, less reliable. And so if we can reverse those things and really get back to relying on energy that is abundant here, that we can make good use of, then that will reduce the uncertainty and reduce the input costs that go into manufacturing and the rest of the economy. So that's a really promising strategy that seems to be taking off with this administration as well.
The criticism that we're seeing from some members of Congress and Democrats about Doge is remarkable to me. They're defending corruption and fraud and waste, and I realize Elon Musk is coming in like a wrecking ball, and he's going to make mistakes, but he's not actually. He doesn't have the power to do anything. He's just pointing out some of this waste and fraud and abuse of our taxpayer money. And you and I, Kurt, have talked about the budget in the past. If all of this federal spending happens to be cut, I mean, that's going to have an impact on the economy as well.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a pretty rich history of of economic analysis that shows when you reduce deficits primarily through spending cuts, then that is the most pro-growth thing you can do. You don't want to raise taxes. That undermines economic activity, makes people worse off. So if you can actually bank those savings and reduce the deficit and get the debt under control in that way, then that will put a big boost into business confidence. So I'm excited about it. You're right that the Doge, Musk, and his people can't do anything directly, but they have basically a free hand to look at everything and say, does this make sense? And if not, they can make recommendations to the White House, to the different agencies. We've seen that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is taking the U.S. Agency for International Development under its wing. The CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, has basically been paused while they reassess everything. And that's a valuable exercise. Now, Congress will have to go back in and approve many of these things in order to reach the savings. But that doesn't mean it's not worth going and looking. I think that would actually change the dynamics and the incentives a lot, because it used to be that, and often still is, that there will be amendments to cut some of this wasteful spending and they don't pass. But with all
Yeah.
of the stories that we're hearing now, it's going to be a lot harder to vote against that.
So hard to keep up with everything that Doge and Donald Trump have done. By the time if you're opposing Donald Trump, by the time you get outraged about one thing, there are 10 other things that he's done to move things forward. It's hard
That's
to
right.
keep up, and I hope Congress can keep up to legislate all of these things that need to be done, because otherwise they can just be overruled in 4 years through an
Mhm.
executive order if a Democrat wins that election. Just kind of wrap things up into a bow, Kurt. Is there a better alternative to tariffs? I mean, you're not opposed to them, but is there anything differently that could be done other than impose or threaten tariffs?
Yeah, I think in all cases, we need to be really careful about what economic instruments are being used and how, because tariffs seem to have a role for bargaining, but they do come at a cost to prosperity, especially if they do continue. So the alternative is to extend, make permanent, and improve on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There's a lot more that can be done to clean up the code, to simplify it, to make it easier for investments to be made, investments in Americans' productivity. So that's really valuable. And at the same time, if you want to make those tax provisions permanent, and we do, then you need to come up with some sort of commensurate savings. Now, we're not weighing in on exactly what that should be. That's a political question as much as a policy question. Congress is working through that, but we're excited about the opportunity to fix healthcare programs so they serve people better while costing less. We're excited about the possibilities for strengthening federalism by moving some of the authorities to the states where they belong. And there's a lot of stuff in the tax code that doesn't belong there as well. There's probably about $11 trillion in tax expenditures over the next decade, true tax expenditures, not what the scorekeepers use. And some chunk of those could be used to make sure that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act improvements on that could be permanent. We've suggested that a 15% corporate rate would be a good choice. One of my colleagues signed a letter on that. And also the deregulatory efforts to just unleash American creativity. That's so important. I've talked with business people who are just frustrated that so much of their job is complying with state government, with local government, with the federal government, and it takes them away from being able to experience the joy of serving their customers in the way that they hope to, that they want to, that they got into business in the first place for.
It's a great way to end it, and I'm glad you brought things back to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I was going to circle back to that. Americansforprosperity.org to learn more, and follow Kurt on X at Kurt Couchman. Thank you for breaking it all down for us.
Thanks for having me, Scott. It's been fun.
And that's going to wrap up this episode of the Scott Sands Show, the podcast. Please be sure to subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on social. I'm on X at Scott Sands Media, Facebook, Instagram, all of the other social platforms as well.